University. My name is Tanya Domi, and I teach in the Balkan Studies program at the Harriman Institute. The Harriman Institute at Columbia University is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and East Central Europe. Our mission is to serve our community in the university and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, and by sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events that bring together our extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. We are committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy, and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. Today, we are going to revisit our annual Balkan Roundtable with a distinguished panel of analysts and journalists. And the topic is about from a hot peace to a hot war, Serbia's escalation in violence, broadsides, both US and EU diplomats. I can honestly say, since I've been moderating the annual Balkan Roundtable, this unfortunately is probably the most tense and difficult moment during this period of many years. It has definitely escalated, and most recently, no one was surprised by this escalation of tensions between Serbia and Kosovo that erupted 12 days ago, most recently, with the Serbian army deploying approximately 8,000 soldiers to the Kosovo border. This followed 2 weekends of consecutive violence, including the killing of Kosovar police and 3 other people that occurred when a Serbian gunman battled police during a monastery siege on September 24th. This resulted in the United States calling on Serbia to withdraw its troops from the border. The United States issued a stern warning, which was also a recent incident that tells you just how concerned the US demonstrated with this call on Serbia. And this follows really almost a year and a half of escalations at the border, which we can get into during the discussion we're having today. I would like to ask my colleague Egon Maliki to actually make opening remarks on the Kosovo-Serbia situation. He most recently published an essay at New Lines Institute, The Kosovo-Serbia Conundrum Reaches a Breaking Point. Kosovo's North emerges as Europe's most vulnerable spot outside of Ukraine. You have Egon is in fact a top analyst on the Kosovo, Albania sectors of the Balkans, and has been very active in his contributions to the analysis on this situation. So you have the microphone, Egon.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you very much for having me and for this very timely discussion. As you said in the last piece, I tried to highlight that Kosovo's North is the most vulnerable hotspot in Europe outside of Ukraine, and that is, the events of the last week kind of proved that. I think in my introductory remarks, I'd like to highlight, first of all, what actually happened. This was, what are the facts that we know? The first is that this was a state-sponsored, structured group that tried to, not just kill the policeman, but most likely tried to initiate an armed insurgency within Kosovo. And the evidence and the footprint is clear. They had weaponry that only they could get through from straight state structures in Serbia. Secondly, what was the aim of this is that, it seems that the aim was to create a new reality on the ground from which Serbia could negotiate on Kosovo's North. it would freeze the north into a separate, distinct reality from the rest of Kosovo, with NATO full control over it. To create more obstacles to the dialogue, because obviously a lot of parties, especially Serbia and Russia, are not interested in the issue being resolved. And I think for the Russian elements that most probably incited or were part of this, there was a hope to open a new front or test NATO. The third element is that the aim was most likely prevented by NATO, Intel, and Kosovo police. I think there is more to it than we are being led to know, because it seems that this was a group that had bigger plans and whose operation was interrupted before it was materialized. So, credit to Kosovo police for managing the situation. But it seems that this was a bit resolved. That there was something bigger could have happened and was likely planned, as was cleared by U.S. Embassy statements very early in the morning. And it seemed that they had a very clear picture of what was happening behind the scenes. What has the situation produced? In Kosovo's perspective, it has reaffirmed Kosovo's sovereignty and territorial integrity and restored a bit of a shaking trust in partners, especially in the U.S. It has increased trust in the capacity of the special police to deal with this kind of situations. And I think it created a bit of a diplomatic opening for Kosovo to make its case. It was a win in that sense. There was winning some moral credibility. I think what the wrong thing is that it created also a little bit of too much euphoria in Pristina, more like the wrong lessons being learned, as if the North has now been won in a way. The thing is that the problem is still there. The Serbs are in the North. The North is still not integrated. But Kosovo does not have an EU-NATO path. And, this thinking that the North can be resolved only with security means and without a political process might become a bit problematic. The third issue is that it has increased the antagonism between Albanians and Serbs. It has never been, the ethnic distance has never been this bad, this far. And even a lot of moderate voices have been radicalized. And the fourth thing is that it has really increased the risk of new incidents, and I don't think this is the last of what we will be seeing. So the risk of the North becoming a bit of like a Northern Ireland, Belfast situation is high. It's clear what needs to be done. There needs to be deterrence established first. The impulse in the West was to say, go back to the dialogue, but some things need to be done first. First, deterrence. Some measures against Serbia need to be taken to deter any further escalations. And KFOR's presence in the North should be increased. And then the political parts should also be moving, a renewed push on dialogue, but while dealing with the asymmetries. The dialogue has not been symmetric. The EU has not treated the side equally. And the policy of appeasement of Vučić has to stop, because he has no more leverage to threaten the region. With Russia being in a position it is, I think the West has the upper hand to really control and dictate developments much more than it is. The problem is that these things are not happening. Yes, KFOR is increasing its presence, but the sanctions are nowhere to be seen. And it's really difficult in this context to trust the mediator. And trust in the mediators is one of the biggest obstacles why the dialogue is failing. And now we have this done by the Serbian list, who have today called for new elections in the North. So we'll see how Kosovo's government responds to that. But we're also seeing from the West this approach of go back to the dialogue, but focusing only on punitive measures and focusing only on Kosovo, and not focusing on the incentives. So we're not seeing what the sides will be getting. So both sides do not trust the mediator, and then they do not trust that they're getting anything in return. So it's going to be very hard to see the process moving forward. I will not go into too much detail, and I would like to give a lot of other people also time to express their thoughts. I just think that it's important to highlight that the geopolitical momentum should not be lost, considering what's happening around the world, of this cascade of wars opening around. The Balkans are becoming increasingly vulnerable, will be out of the map or parked in Western diplomatic offices even further deeper than they are right now. And especially in a context where in a year from now, we might not have this level of transatlantic unity in place. We don't know what's going to happen with the US elections, what's going to happen in a lot of European countries' elections. So leaving the North and the Kosovo-Serbia dispute the way it is will really amplify the risks going forward. And if, Azerbaijan, Armenia escalated the way it did, because it's too far away from NATO and EU, and Israel-Palestine is doing the same, and Ukraine is, has turned into a hot war. Maybe the Balkans are still at bay because NATO and EU are so close. But, in a future context, if, we don't have this guarantee. So I think we need to stress the urgency of moving forward with a political solution that is fair and that treats Kosovo and Serbia, does not treat the sides asymmetrically. And I will just end there and pass the floor to the other speakers.
Sorry, I'm muted. I don't know why. Okay, I'm going to come back. Thank you again for your opening remarks. I'm going to come back. I'll circle back, and I will be coming to you, Alice, about your reporting on what took place in Kosovo. You had extensive reporting. So now I'm going to go to Ivana Stradner for her take on Serbia at this moment of quite a contested situation. And I look forward to hearing your remarks, Ivana.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for inviting me again this year. And I'm afraid that every year when I attend this panel, I just repeat my arguments over and over again, because unfortunately we see the repetition of the escalations in the Balkans again. So what we saw in the late September really did not come as a surprise to anyone who has been watching the Balkans. And the reason for that is because right now, with Russia's war in Ukraine, Putin has been trying to open numerous fronts. And the Balkans is definitely a soft underbelly. So what we saw really last week offered two opportunities for both Serbia, but also Russia. So President Vučić has had this strategy of balancing between East and West for many, many years, and it really worked well. It worked well, because he was able to get his concessions with Russia, but also to be on the European Union path for a long time, to get American investments, but also to have deals with China. But with Russia's war in Ukraine, things have shifted drastically. And President Vučić has no more maneuver that he used to have to play those games. So his ultimate goal is truly to remain in power and to continue with his ruling for as long as possible and try to portray himself as a new Josip Broz Tito. And to remain in power for as long as possible. In addition to that, his peddling of nationalism for a very long time has created a lot of problems also in Serbia, because he strengthened the far-right groups, but also he destroyed the true liberal opposition. So the situation, right now in Serbia is such that he positioned himself as a source of stability in the region and as someone that the West can negotiate with, which is a very similar, actually, strategy what Putin did when as soon as he came to power, by destroying the liberal opposition, strengthening the far-right groups, so he can actually be somewhere in the middle. So the ultimate goal really arises as to why does Vučić need escalations in the Balkans? What we saw last week, again, this is really nothing new, because just a few months ago, we had fighter jets on the border after many, many months of escalations related to also license plates. But the reason why he really needs that is to escalate the crisis and then to de-escalate the crisis and then to position himself as a source of stability. And the West, unfortunately, has been falling for this trick for a very long time. What we saw last week, unfortunately, his strategy worked, even to some extent. Luckily, this time the West has acknowledged also the Serbian role in this escalation. I also want to add to this thing, whoever believes that Serbia will say no to Russia anytime soon, I don't believe that that's possible, because the government of Serbia needs Moscow for its political survival. And the ultimate question arises as to really, what is Russia's role over there? Russia does not need to send tanks and jets to the region and to help Serbia to accomplish its goals. All Russia really needs to do is to provide intelligence and to provide already proxies that it has in the region to escalate the crisis, and then put in position himself as a mediator and to blackmail the West. If the West wants the peace, then they have to negotiate with Putin. So that's really the big picture that's happening. Unfortunately, it's not only Kosovo. Serbia has been influencing tremendously politics in Montenegro, but also what we noticed, like recently in Bosnia and Herzegovina with the latest secessionist movements, it's also the part of how Belgrade operates, but also with the help from Moscow. I'm not very positive that this particular escalation will end here. I do believe that we can expect more. As a matter of fact, it's in large part because the West has forgotten to promote democracy in the region. That has not been the primary role over the past decade for the West. And the consequences are more than obvious. One thing that I really want to stress out is that Putin has been looking for weak links of NATO to show that NATO is nothing more than a paper tiger. And what we saw, for example, in May when dozens of NATO peacekeepers were injured, it was a really dream come true. And that's something that I believe, that we can expect similar incidents in the future. And this is precisely why the presence of KFOR is important, not only in terms of the number, but also in terms of the action. Because make no mistakes, but what we saw last week, I have no doubt that similar incidents will continue. President Vučić has announced new elections, so he also has to appease the far-right audience. And the last thing that I want to also emphasize is that Serbian EU path has stalled. And whenever analysts in the West tell me that Serbia being closer towards the West can actually be a wonderful carrot. In theory, yes. In practice, no. Why? Because if you listen carefully to Vučić's statements, he rarely talks about EU membership. He talks about EU path. Why? Because he needs EU funding also for his political survival, and being the part of the European Union would jeopardize his ruling. Having said that, democratic processes in the region are a threat also to his power, because the more democratic region is, the worse he will look in the eyes of the West. And finally, what should we do about that? To begin with, last year, I remember in your panel, I was trying to raise the awareness. This time, I do not even need to raise the awareness because things are more than obvious. I do believe that NATO should make the coalition of the willing to send a credible and capable signal that any threat to NATO unity will be met with a response. NATO should also send hybrid warfare teams in the region to fight information operations, because make no mistake, this is indeed a hybrid war that has two components. On one side, before the kinetic use of force, there is always the precondition, which is information operations. And the third thing is there is a famous Russian that I've been writing for years about reflexive control, how Russia is reflexively really control the West, and the West is full for it. Basically, they feed us with information that we believe that benefit us, but actually benefits Russia. So that's something that in the information space, it's immensely important that we counter that before it's too late, because all those propaganda, such as, for example, Belgrade is filled with posters and graffiti. Kosovo is Serbia when the army returns to Kosovo. Russia, with the help of Serbia, have been peddling the nationalist narratives. You can hear like a patriotic songs in the region, in Serbia in particular. They're very nationalistic. And while a lot of people may laugh about this kind of like a soft power, those things are really an immensely important indicator about the role of the hybrid war. And one other thing that I want to conclude, which is, while the majority of my speech has focused on Kosovo, I really cannot stress enough that also Bosnia and Montenegro are struggling a lot. So I will end here, and I look forward to speaking with you later.
Thank you, Ivana. For the audience, Ivana published an essay with the New Lines Institute as well, Russia's Influence in the Balkans. I recommend it to people who are interested in knowing more. Now I'm going to Dan Server, who is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is been a consistent blogger on the Balkans. All of us await his weekly, if not 2 times a week. Recently, he's increased his blogging. Dan is also a retired diplomat and been a very strong critic of U.S. foreign policy in the region. I give the microphone over to you now, Dan. You're muted, Dan.
Thank you, Tanya.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to continue my critique of American and European policy. But I want to start by saying that I judge policy not by what people say, but what they do and don't do. And I think it's very clear that current American and European policy in the Balkans is attempting, as Agon said, to appease Belgrade, but I also think it's effectively supporting ethnic separation. Let me look at the cases of Bosnia and Kosovo to support my thesis. In Bosnia, I think you see very clearly that there is much greater tolerance for Čović and Dodik, who are ethnic separatists, than there has been in the past. Dodik is essentially living almost as if he's sanction-free. Čović has received very ample support from the High Representative, and that can't happen without the Americans and the Europeans being okay with it. But perhaps the most dramatic sign of American and European policy change in Bosnia is the failure to support the implementation of court decisions, European Court of Human Rights decisions, especially the Kovačević decision, the most recent one, which simply negates the basis of the Dayton Constitution. They're not going to support that. They haven't said anything about it, really. They haven't even continued to support implementation of the Sejdić-Finci decision, the first of a whole long series of decisions that undermine the ethno-nationalist basis of governance in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I think we have to take very seriously the proposition that de facto they are supporting, the Americans and Europeans are supporting ethnic nationalists and ethnic separation in Bosnia. In Kosovo, I think it's also very, very clear. The September 24th events have not elicited anything but talking points from Brussels and Washington. They've essentially done nothing in response to a Serbian government sponsored insurrectionist effort inside northern Kosovo. And in fact, the Europeans in particular are still insisting on their conditions on Kosovo from before September 24th, which include withdrawal of the police who were effective and professional on September 24th and cooperated closely with NATO. Europeans still want them withdrawn despite the obvious continuing threat in that area, and they're still insisting on the association of Serb majority municipalities, which is clearly intended by Belgrade as a separate governing structure. Now, the Americans say they won't allow that. They say it in an op-ed, but when I ask them, are you willing to say that in writing as an American government commitment, as witnesses or supporters of any agreement between Belgrade and Pristina, the answer is no. They're not willing to actually guarantee that the association won't become a separate governing entity. They're willing to say it, but not do it. So if, in fact, the Americans and Europeans have gone from a policy basically of supporting multi-ethnic democracy in the Balkans and being opposed to Belgrade's efforts at creating the Serbian world, which is nothing else than Greater Serbia, if in fact they have changed their policies, the question that arises is, why did they do this? And part of the answer is, for the Americans especially, that the Balkans have fallen off the priority list. They are just way down the list by now. Nobody's willing to do any heavy lifting in the Balkans. And some of the officials concerned with the Balkans have promised that they can bring Serbia into the West. There is no evidence that they can do this. There is no evidence that they have made the slightest progress in doing it. The only evidence I know of is the ammunition that Serbia allows to go to Ukraine, but nobody has been able to answer my question, how much Serbian ammunition goes to Russia? Because I'm sure the support for the Russian military is stronger than the support for Ukraine. So in the US, I think it's a combination of no priority and a false claim that Serbia can be brought into the West. In the EU, I think the explanation, to my mind, is a little bit different. It's a lowest common denominator explanation, which is often the case in EU policy. And that lowest common denominator has effectively become Hungary. And it's perhaps no surprise that when you have the prime European negotiators, one a Spaniard and the other a Slovak, both of whose countries don't recognize Kosovo, that they're not uncomfortable with the Hungarian lowest common denominator. And they seem to me to be supporting it quite amply, much more, frankly, than I expected of either of them. But in effect, what we've got here is an abandonment of the traditional American and European approach in the Balkans. And I think it's important to recognize that. I think it's particularly important for people in Pristina to recognize that, because it represents a real threat to Kosovo's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which basically the West isn't seriously supporting anymore. Something similar is true in Bosnia, of course, except that in Bosnia, you know, the people who would oppose ethno-nationalist governance lack political traction. They also lack any good means of expressing their politics under the Dayton Constitution, but they lack political traction as well. So I'm pessimistic. I think this is the formula for tragedy in the Balkans.
Thank you, Dan, very much. moving to Bodo Weber. So delighted to have Bodo join us. This is the first time at the Harriman Balkan Roundtable. He is a senior associate of the Democratization Policy Council, Transatlantic Policy Analysis and Advocacy Group, promoting accountability in Western democracy promotion. It's delightful to have you here, Bodo, and worked very closely with your colleagues also at DPC. So the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Tanya. A true honor to be with you. Hello from Berlin. I want to, continue where Dan has basically started off from the EU and particularly the German perspective. Let me make one introductory remark that Dan already stole from me, unfortunately, and then 5 key points on the current mess and why we have this mess with the Banska terrorist attacks. So introductory remark, for a couple of years, we see this transatlantic, including among some analysts, ping pong game about, who is to blame, the US or the EU for the current mess. I think, as Dan noted, I think this is completely pointless. At least from sometime around 2015, 16, this is clearly a joint transatlantic mess with joint responsibility. What we see in the Balkans is the reflection of a decade and a half of the crisis of the West on both ends of the Atlantic that started with the Iraq war invasion and that led to a gradual retreat from the world stage and finally exploded last year on 24th of February with the Russian-Ukraine intervention. So that as an introductory remark, I will nevertheless focus on the EU and Germany. Second point, let me come to the current EU-led dialogue initiative, what the role is and why this led us to this lowest point in the dialogue, maybe even before the dialogue with this Banska attack escalation in the north of Kosovo. So at the heart of the current initiative, with the so-called basic agreement and Ohrid agreement from spring this year, is the German-French initiative. And that has a German leading role because, the main authors were the Germans, not the French. We know that in the Balkans. And that the lead role here was in the Chancellor's office. So what was this? This initiative from the beginning was doomed to failure, and it created the current mess. Why is this? Because instead of after the dangerous and really, really evil 3-year land swap episode, instead of getting to a lessons learned, getting to a reset of the negotiations on a truly sustainable, final, and comprehensive agreement, with Serbia's recognition of Kosovo at its core, the Chancellor's office opted for something much lower, a vague intermediate agreement based on what has already been said by various speakers so far, on the continuation of the West's policy, appeasement policy towards Vučić and Serbia. And this is my third point. So on the latter, instead of making use of the Ukraine war window of opportunity that, to my understanding, emerged on the 24th of February last year, with Serbia as the actor coming most under pressure with this invasion, for a strategic U-turn on the Serbia policy of the West, to get tough on all 3 fronts with Serbia, on democracy, on Kosovo, and on the geopolitical maneuvering in between East and West. This initiative doubled down on this appeasement policy, and talking about division of work, the lead role on that Serbia appeasement was handed over to the US by the Germans. So this is my third point. The fourth point, we need to look this initiative from a leadership shift from the Merkel era to the Scholz era. Let's start with Merkel first. I mean, with Merkel, when I personalized this whole shift in leadership, we had somebody who was perfect in crisis management leadership, but she had no strategy. She was no strategist and no visionary. The consequence of that was that she picked up managerial leadership in 2011 when we had the last major crisis in Kosovo to make a historic start through the political dialogue. Starting with the trading democracy in Serbia for the dialogue, but because of a lack of a strategy, throughout this 10 years, she at the end of this decade was left empty-handed, both on democracy and in Kosovo, instead ending up in a tragic symbiosis with the Vučić regime that she had enabled. So come forward to the shift to Scholz and why we did not get to a reset on a final agreement, but to this wake agreement initiative by the Chancellor's office. We have a very much different setting with Scholz from a personality point of view. While there was some kind of vision on the Balkan policy, and in his first trip in June last year to Pristina and Belgrade, his problems are twofold: weak on leadership and political will, and completely also lacking of strategy. My fifth point, the interplay between Berlin, the lead role, and the two EU negotiators, Borrell and Lajčák. So this German leadership and the German-French initiative, it set the stage and the framework within which the two negotiators had to operate. But one has to say that those two negotiators, perfectly, complementary one and the other, have gone the extra mile in this appeasement policy, and further, complicating the process and making the mess. So I mean, while I would say Mr. Lajčák was perfect in going the extra pro-Belgrade appeasement mile, then you had Mr. Borrell, who I would say, on an operational level, a totally amateurish, the worst negotiator among all EU foreign policy chiefs in this decade of political dialogue, with his amateurism and his age problem, which is obviously there, then made the mess even bigger. We have seen that in Ohrid. We have those who know it have seen it at the last meeting in September 14 with Vučić and Kurti, which was the last evident sign that this doomed to failed initiative has definitely failed. So one last point: where are we currently? We are currently at a stage we have seen time and again over the last 3 decades, us who deal with the Balkans, where an initiative that, because of lacking political will, was doomed to failure, has already failed. Everybody intimately knows it. I beg you, though I cannot prove that the actors in Berlin to know it, that the actors in Brussels know it, but this is this intermediate phase where none of the Earth, because of having heavily invested in, is yet ready to admit it. So that's why after Banska, we basically see a shifting, getting a little bit tough on Serbia, finally for the first time, but at the same time doubling down on this failed initiative that everybody knows it's failed. So I mean, we are in an intermediate period. It will probably not end unless the European elections and Mr. Lajčák is gone. Maybe he will flee from his current post, like he fled as a failed high representative in Bosnia, again to the post of Slovak foreign minister. That would be helpful. Maybe it will even not wait until even longer than until the next new commission comes in. Maybe even it will have to wait. That would be really disappointing from my German point of view, until we have the new German government in, which is beginning of 2025. This initiative did not only fail, this would not be something new, but it was much, much more serious in terms of damage than any previous initiative, failed initiative in the dialogue. Why is this? Because each previous initiative, even the evil land swap episode, it left the Kosovo and the status dispute behind with status quo. This one has unsettled the status quo in the north. It has created a rule of law vacuum by allowing, which is unjustifiable from the EU, I'm pointing on the US side, but also in European, but particularly on the US side, allowing Mr. Vučić to order Kosovo Serbs in the north in November last year to leave Kosovo police and judiciary, promising them secession, which then didn't happen. This should have never been allowed, because as Agron already mentioned, the attempt by Kosovo police, whether you see the necessity or not to a certain degree to jump in with Kosovo police and fill that vacuum, can never function, because you cannot integrate that territory without integrating the Kosovo Serb population. And we have, as an effect of this whole failed policy with this Serbian list, also a side effect of or a side collateral damage in certain units of the failed dialogue. We have a nexus, and that's what Banska is all about. It's an embodiment of this, a nexus of a one-part, unplanned, unintended in the dialogue. One-party system, nexus with organized crime, a double patronage system in between two municipal structures of two states. So Kosovo Serbs alienated by all actors, Belgrade, Serbian list, but also by Pristina and by the West. So this is a dangerous downward trajectory that does not allow us and the West to be complacent and wait until this intermediate period that is currently in place is gone, until everybody is ready, or the new people in the Western capitals to declare, to accept that this approach has failed, and a new reset of the negotiations and the dialogue needs to start. We need to sanitize this damage and at least restore some kind of status quo. Now, this will be very hard with Pristina because we have completely lost our credibility with Pristina. So that can only happen by getting to our terms after Banska with Serbia and starting a real U-turn and getting tough on Serbia. And I stop here.
Thank you, Bodo. That's really depressing. But I think it's spot on. I'm going to move to Ralph Bajrović. Ralph is the vice president of the U.S.-Europe Alliance in Washington, D.C., and a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I want to also plug his essay that was published by New Lines last month on the limitations of Turkey's Western Balkans policy since Erdogan's re-election. I've asked Ralph to address Bosnia and Herzegovina, who has really been squeezed in this centrifugal dynamics between Zagreb, Belgrade, and the dynamics playing out in Kosovo at the border with Serbia. Over to you, Ralph. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Hello to my dear friends and colleagues on this panel. Tanya, just to make sure, so we have 5 minutes, 5 to 7, right?
5 to 7, yes.
All right, I'm going to try to, be disciplined. So Bosnia has a new government, which was imposed at the federation level by the Office of the High Representative. It was a very unusual move in many ways because it set a new precedent whereby the number of votes that certain parties got during elections is no longer the only measurement of political success. It is now equally important, after what we saw about 6 months ago when the High Representative literally imposed the new government in the federation, is basically that not only do parties have to fight for votes from the Bosnian citizens, they also have to fight for the international community's position on whether they can or cannot be in government. And in the almost 30 years since the Dayton Accords, so almost full 28 years now, we have never ever seen a situation like we saw with what Schmidt did during the federation government formation process. Patty Ashdown would remove politicians, but Patty Ashdown or people before or after him never actually imposed governments. The federation government was imposed by the decision of the Office of High Representative. Now, why did I start with that? Why is it so important? Because it was, in my view, the final proof of the West's new view, new approach to Bosnia. One of my previous speakers, I believe it was Dan, said that this is a new phase in the Western policy towards the region. And I think this is the correct way to analyze where we are now in terms of Western policy towards the Western Balkans. But what's interesting in Bosnia is that the federation government was formed after the HDZ, the party, the Bosnian Croat Ethnic Nationalist Party, blocked the government formation process for full 4 years before that. So there was, the last time government was formed was in 2015. So what preceded the imposition of the new government, the federation, was an incredible, truly breathtaking political ride of government formation at the state level, which the participants of the government formation process at the state level are on the record saying that the Western diplomats, US government officials, US Embassy, European Union delegation, insisted that the Sarajevo-based parties include Milorad Dodik in the state level government. Now, this is an incredible moment in what we've seen in Bosnia in the last 30 years, because the basis of the Western posture for 20 plus years in the region was that Bosnia was supposed to go towards EU and NATO. And then after all those years, you have Western diplomats doing their absolute maximum effort to include Dodik in government and give him the key portfolios of security ministry, give him de facto control over the intelligence agency, give him veto powers within government since he is in government now. And to add to his, strengthening his position is to give his main partner, Dragan Čović, who's the head of the Bosnian ethnic Croat party, HDZ, the same level of influence at the state level government. Now, there are still observers who believe that this is simply Western diplomats' incompetence, and that's the good case scenario in the case of Bosnia. Now, I don't believe that anymore. I mean, since most of us or all of us on this panel are in touch or were in touch and know people who make decisions in the Western capitals, and since a lot of us are actually in contact and were in contact with people who made decisions, I think it is, we have to accept the fact that what Dan said and what Bodo said, and Agon alluded to it as well, that there's a new approach to the region that was never officially announced. We can't, there isn't a single serious statement on the record that we can point to, and when we write about these things or talk about these things. But when you look at the actual policy, when you look at what they do, it is absolutely impossible to escape the conclusion that the West simply wants the Balkans to stay where it is. Status quo is the real policy. EU and NATO integration is not the policy for Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia, and so on. Macedonia, I think certainly not. There is a new pecking order in the region whereby Serbia is supposed to rule the Western Balkans countries except for Albania. Albania gets some influence over Kosovo. Serbia gets Montenegro, gets half of Bosnia. Croatia gets half of Bosnia. And Macedonia is in some sort of limbo between Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece. And of course, Albania because of the Albanian minority. So the West has given up on multi-ethnic states in the region. The West has decided there are certain ethnic groups in the region. And I think that it's the Albanians in Kosovo, Bosniaks everywhere, Montenegrins in Montenegro, who do not have the right to have the same level of influence and sovereignty as the Serbs, Croats, and Albanians in the region. And I hope that I'm absolutely wrong about this. Honestly speaking, I wish next year, if we do reconvene, if we're all alive, if we actually survive the upcoming crisis in the Middle East, that things do not pan out the way I see them right now. And I think that this has, a lot of people have attributed this change to lobbying, to what Serbia and Croatia did in Washington, what Croatia does in Brussels on a daily basis, and so on. I no longer think that. My view is that this is a result of a hard, calculated decision to make sure that the Balkans does not blow up at a time when the West can't even deal with the Russia-Ukraine war, because there's absolutely no appetite for any kind of serious decision making in Europe, especially. I think Washington is overwhelmed with the gridlock within U.S. government, and there's a general feeling of tiredness. The West simply wants to take a break from the world. This is, I think, the reason that the decision makers in Washington have decided to simply park the region, make it as stable as possible, and just forget about it. The way they've, in my view, I don't want to distract now us from, but I think a lot of people in the know think that they did the same thing with Palestine, Israel issues. They try to park Palestine and, deal with the Saudis, deal with the regional powers, and try to strike some sort of a deal. I think the same approach was applied to the Balkans, and I think the Biden administration is to blame for this. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the Trump administration, for all of its faults, and it was just not great, was far less malign for the region than the folks who occupy the White House right now. Europe, Bodo has said it, right? It's the lowest common denominator. The Hungarians have managed to take over the policy when it comes to the region. You have Arheli, you have now the new head of EUFOR command in Bosnia is a Hungarian general. Please do not laugh.
Make it up.
So
You can't make it up. You can't make it up.
Exactly, you can't make it up. And that's my 6 to 7 minutes, Tanya. Thank you very much. I hope we continue this.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Ralph, very much. Yes, this is, I agree with your assessment now that this is a cold calculation by the West. There's no appetite for anything. It's managerial approach. And when you manage, you don't get credit for anything. And then you have really hashtag failure on the dialogue. I mean, so badly that it almost ended up in war, which is really, really frightening. So the next speaker is Milka Tadic-Mijovic, who's a Montenegrin journalist. She's also an international recognized human rights activist, and she's one of the founders of the Weekly Monitor, which is the first independent media outlet in Montenegro. I've asked her to make some short remarks about what's going on in Montenegro right now. And of course, when we get to questions, I want to get broader comments about Montenegro, and also we'll go back to the Kosovo-Serbia situation, because I want to get Alice in here and Maria to talk about how Serbia has portrayed the reporting. And Alice has done extensive reporting on the Serbia-Kosovo situation. So hang in there with us. We're getting to you. Over to you, Milka.
Tanya, thank you very much. It was really great to see you all and to talk. It's not really that great topic, but it's great to talk to you about these important topics. When I have been listening, all of you, I have been thinking who really actually won in the Balkans. I mean, the nationalists, the autocrats, the allies of Milosevic, I mean, some of them are still running these countries. And I think the main problem is that we actually never transform those countries to the functional democracies. This is the main problem, I think, of Serbia, in Bosnia, we have no functional state. In Montenegro as well, we never had a functional democracy. So the warriors from the 90s are unfortunately still in charge, and I think this is our main problem. I don't think that really West recognized whom to support in the Balkans. We have been talking about Vučić, but in last couple of years, West has been supporting very strongly Vučić, negotiating with him, and he was, of course, playing with both with Russia and with the West in the same time. And we do not know what will be his next step and how he will really deal with this huge problem which we already have in Kosovo. Is this beginning what we saw a few 10 days ago of something which might really put Balkans in a new circle of violence, or is somebody really intending to stop this violence? Those are all the questions which we have to face. But back to Montenegro, as you all know, for the first time in entire Montenegrin history, Montenegro changed government for the first time 3 years ago through the elections. And after 3 decades, DPS, Democratic Party of Socialists, which ran our country for more than 3 decades, lost the power. But what we have after these 3 years, we have right now in Montenegro, we have no functional government. We had elections a few months ago, beginning of June, but we are still negotiating about the new government. Nobody won majority, and we have very complicated negotiations, and we do not know still who will be in this new government and who will be really in charge. The party which won most seats, it's Europe, called Europe Now. It's a new political party with new people. We do not know actually who. They are talking mostly about economy, about the wages, about economic reforms, but with whom he will form the government, we still do not know. Right now, we do not have a functional parliament because there is, of course, we have just new members of the parliament we have them in the parliament, but parliament is not functioning. We have no president, we have no parliamentary bodies. So we cannot have new laws in the parliament. We do not have a president of the parliament. So we will not have a functional parliament till we do not have a government. That is, and the new coalition which we need. So, and it's not just that. We do not have a functional judiciary because we do not have a supreme head of the Supreme Court. The political party, to have a head of Supreme Court, we need a compromise between opposition and those who are in power. And for last 5 years, we as a country were not able to get a compromise and to appoint a new head of the Supreme Court. And some other as well position in judiciary are not, some other judiciary representatives are not appointed. We do not have a state prosecutor as well, and the Constitutional Court as well is not filled with the seventh judge. We have only 6 of them, and because of this number, the Constitutional Court can be blocked. So situation is really very, very complicated. On the other hand, the country has deep problem with corruption and organized crime. We have very important figures from the previous regime under the charges. For example, the former head of Supreme Court is accused for the links with the organized crime and drug cartels. Some other people from the high position are as well under the investigations, and on another hand, we do not have a functional judicial system, as I said. So situation is really very complicated. Which way Montenegro will go? As you all know, Montenegro is deeply divided society. And I believe this division is actually a legacy of not just the influence of Serbia and Russia, but as well of the Mr. Đukanović, who didn't manage to make a functional democracy in Montenegro and to make this country for all, not just for the corrupted political elite which has been running the country for so many years. On another hand, I think that West made a big mistake, not just in the case of Serbia, but in case of Montenegro as well. They have been supporting autocratic leaders instead to support the reforms and democracy. So this, I think, is the biggest mistake of the West. Not just in Serbia, but in other Balkan countries. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you.
And of course, I'm open for your questions.
Thank you so much, Milka. First of all, I want to thank everybody for your presentations, and I want to go really quickly on these questions, but I want to move to Alice Taylor, who did. She did an extensive interview of the foreign minister of Kosovo and reporting on the EU Commission, who basically says to Osmani, dialogue with Serbia must continue. Given the previous comments in your interview with the foreign minister, Alice, do you have any thoughts on like how possibly Kosovo would want to reset on the diplomatic front? But I just want to hear your thoughts, because you've been one of the top journalists on reporting about the situation in Serbia, Kosovo.
I found it utterly staggering. And I mean, the EU spokespeople, I find them pretty clumsy at the best of times, but I found it absolutely staggering that there could be any suggestion that anybody could sit around a table as if absolutely nothing had happened after the incident of the 24th of September. I don't know whose idea it was to come out and say that, and how they were able to deliver it with a straight face. I have the freedom to say that now because I'm not writing an article about it. But it was very interesting. Actually, I interviewed just yesterday the former US ambassador to Kosovo, Filip Koznet, yesterday. And he said, you know, after what's happened, yes, dialogue does need to continue at some point, but it's not business as usual. And we cannot go back to sitting around the same table, addressing the same issues. You cannot ask a country that's just had a terrorist attack to withdraw, reduce its special units that were there to combat the exact sort of incident that just happened. You cannot force a country to go against its constitution, and you definitely can't do that in a context where it appears that the same group of people were wanting to take over part of the country. The whole idea of this association of Serb municipalities, which personally I do not believe Serbia's interest in, has anything to do with the rights of Serbs in Kosovo. Zero. They have the framework, the legal framework for minorities in Kosovo is the strongest in Europe. It's got nothing to do with that. But I do not see how we can sit down, how people can sit down at a table and continue to discuss that association, considering that Serbia may have had a hand in trying to annex the north of Kosovo. this is just absolutely impossible. And it was actually very nice to hear a former diplomat being so straight about this. Obviously, he's not a diplomat anymore, so he could say it. He also told me as well, and actually, he told me as well, he said that sometimes he had to give statements, and inside he was sort of thinking, oh my God, I don't agree with this, but he has to follow the line. And that was quite refreshing honesty to hear as well. He also talked about, and this echoes my feelings as well, that the West has had this appeasement towards Serbia. It's very much treated Serbia as the most important country in the Western Balkans. It's looked at Serbia sort of edging towards Russia and China more and more and more into their arms lovingly, and it's trying to coax them away as much as possible. But this is clear. It's clear now. This is not yielding results. It's not working. The approach is not going to work in the future, and it's time for a completely new approach to this. Now, I was always someone who thought measures against Serbia would be a good thing because they need to be punished or whatever. I thought that the measures against Kosovo should be withdrawn. I don't think they should have been enforced in the first place. But the former ambassador did make a very interesting point as well, that in diplomacy, punishment doesn't always work, and sometimes incentivizing is a better approach. He suggested that there are perhaps political, economical, and other kinds of carrots that can be dangled rather than taking a stick to everybody involved. I'm not sure how well this will work with Serbia though, because I'm not convinced that they're particularly interested in joining the EU. I think they like the money that's on the table, but if they look east towards Russia and China, there's potentially a lot more money there as well. So I'm not sure how this would work in practice. But there can be absolutely no return to dialogue. And I want to make another point as well to do with the loss of faith in the EU mediators. Now, I don't think it's an issue of whether Lajčák and Borrell are biased. Do I think they're biased? Yes, I do. They come from countries which don't recognize Kosovo. But if a party in the process loses trust in a mediator for whatever reason, whether it's right or wrong, whether they're correct or not, if they lose trust, it has failed. They have to be able to trust everyone involved. So it's not a matter of whether they're actually biased or not. If someone loses trust, you have to bring somebody into this. I interviewed Prime Minister Edi Rama yesterday, and he said that, maybe we should look at elevating it to a more regional effort, bring in other stakeholders, other countries, have a more collaborative approach. This was shot down by the foreign minister of Kosovo previously. She doesn't think this is a good idea, but it could perhaps bring a more balanced approach to the table where the EU is clearly failing at the moment, and until the end of the mandate, we're not going to be able to just switch out the High Representative and the Special Envoy. So this is an issue as well. And I mean, there's many, many more things I could go into here because this is my beat, but these are the main points that I wanted to make on this.
Thank you so much, Alice. Alice is based in Albania and has been there since 2017. She's writing a book on Kosovo, and she and the other two journalists, Maria Shaikas and Milka Tadicmijovic, all three of them have helped my students, and I want to publicly thank them. They've facilitated getting information to students who are writing papers, and it's really wonderful to have them all here. So thank you again, Alice. Very important points. I think a reset with new people is a good idea. I just don't see how they get there. But Maria, what is your view on how this has been reported, this escalation has been reported or not? We know that that Vučić is really, it's a state capture of media. There's hardly any, if it's questionable, any kind of independent media in Serbia at this time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tanya, for inviting me. And also, I'm really glad to be on the panel with esteemed colleagues. to understand Kosovo and reporting about Kosovo, I believe, as some of other panelists also mentioned before, that we need to go back possibly 30, 40 years ago. To the time of possibly Milosevic, and the fact that he, most of his initial popularity was built on Kosovo. And from that time, actually, we have we could trace the whatever is happening in most of the media in Serbia right now. So in the time of Milosevic, we have very prominently in media, standing places such as Kosovo je srce Serbia, or Kosovo is the heart of Serbia. So whenever from about that time onwards, we, journalists were reporting about Kosovo. It was always, or not always, but it was, we were reminded that Kosovo is heart of Serbia, or sebe damo, Kosovo ne damo. We will give ourselves, but we will never give Kosovo. From that time, we also have, in very many cases in very popular media, reporting about Kosovo as so-called Kosovo. Representatives of Kosovo are so-called, premier of Kosovo. Police of Kosovo is so-called police of Kosovo. And I'm mentioning all of that to leap into present time when you open the media nowadays, and you can see that it's so-called Kosovo throughout the media, with exception of few, and I will mention that. It's so-called premier of Kosovo, Albin Kurti. It's so-called Republic of Kosovo, or Kosovo. So we didn't have, with the exception of the period after the democratic changes in Serbia, we didn't have a different way of approaching or reporting about Kosovo in majority of media. And then also, I have to say that the main villain in Serbian media was often in relation to Kosovo. So in the time of Milosevic, that was mostly UČK or OVK, and nowadays it's basically so-called Premier Albin Kurti. So some of the titles are Kurti targeting Serb, Kurti is hunting Serbs, Kurtis terrorists killing Serb monsters who are, under Kurti. So we have clear and obvious vilification of Prime Minister Kurti. This is, to answer how is Kosovo reported in Serbia medias nowadays. Going toward talking about the incident in Banjska, I'm really glad that Agon spoke so eloquently about the backgrounds of the incident, because just listening to Serbian media, you couldn't hear most of it. So even independent media, and we have some independent media, really good award-winning independent media in Serbia still. We have N1 with the biggest reach, we have Danas, we have Vreme, we have really good investigative portals. But only listening to those people, or government sponsored or government close to the government media, you couldn't really understand what's the background in Kosovo. Why was, Banjska, what happened in Banjska? Although Danas and N1 had their reporters in Pristina, although they were broadcasting whatever was, their police saying at that time and things like that. So the media in Serbia reports without having a bigger picture, understanding of a bigger picture. If it is media which is close to the government, then it reports in a way that I described, more or less, with some variations. Of course, tabloids and tabloid TVs are the worst, with, Kurti hunting Serbs in Kosovo, with some others, such as the public broadcaster, being more restrained, but with them it's also so-called police of Kosovo. And when I talked to my colleagues from the national broadcaster and asked, why are you calling them so-called? They're saying that they're following the whatever is the, the official way of Serbian state is talking about Kosovo, and when that is changed, they will change the way they report about it. Yes, so we have all of that at the moment in Serbia. And then I think that actually the best source of information for Serbs in Serbia at the moment is KOSEP, which is a Kosovo-based outlet in the Serbian language. And they're getting really big exposure in Serbian independent media. And I want to mention Serbian independent media real quickly as a counterbalance of that horrible propaganda and censorship that we actually have nowadays in majority of Serbian media. We have BIRN reporting, actually breaking a story about the fact that majority of our arm and munition that was discovered in Kosovo was Serbia made. So, BIRN reported that story. And Istinomer, for instance, is debunking all the fake stories that are posted mostly by tabloids. So yes, we have a lot of propaganda, I want to say, and those things are real, but at the same time, we have investigative outlets as well. And very quickly about the really big Russian influence, it was actually, I'm with my colleague Milka, who is present here. Milka and I actually wrote a first piece about the Russian influence in media in Serbia and Montenegro in 2016. And from 2016 until very recently, we weren't able to get any particular interest in the West about the fact that Russians are, establishing their cultural centers, that their media is very, is getting at the Balkans, that the monuments and builds and things like that. It's only with the, I think, situation in Ukraine that West is now understanding or trying, beginning to understand the Russian presence and the influence that it has. That was all from me. Thank you very much. Tanya, I think you are muted.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I want to ask really quickly, very short answers. I know this is challenging, but I want to go to Bodo and Dan and Ralph and ask about a reset on diplomacy and how they might see it very quickly, a reset on the dialogue and about the overall crisis in the region. I mean, I think Alice brings up a really interesting point when she interviewed Eddie Rama, that there might be a regional approach that's necessary at this time, given the precarity in Bosnia, in Montenegro, and obviously Kosovo, Serbia. So let's go to Bodo first, Dan second, and Ralph third.
I'd be much briefer this time. I think I answered the question on the reset on the Kosovo-Serb dialogue. As I said, the reset must be returning to what we have had only declaratively in 2017, negotiations on a final comprehensive agreement, truly sustainable, truly finally a comprehensive agreement with Kosovo recognition by Serbia at its core. That's the only framework within which we can solve the issue of the dilemma about the ASM, because I agree with colleague Alice that the problem created by the ASM was that this in 2013, when it was brought up and put into, upon Serbia's request, into the 2013 April agreement, was at the same way, we have all forgotten even this, like the West at the end in 2013 in the implementation of that agreement, ahead of first local Kosovo elections in the north, to allow Belgrade to establish a joint list, the Serbian list. This was meant not as a tool to create additional, which is not possible, as Alice pointed, create additional minority rights for Serbs. There's nothing normatively, legally additional to add to the Ahtisaari plan, to the Kosovo constitution. This was about forced in Belgrade, and we had forced them to a U-turn on Serbia, on Kosovo, to tell poor Serbs in the north they had been told in this quasi-colonial relationship between Belgrade and the Kosovo Serbs in the north after 3 decades that they are part of Serbia, that they ultimately will end up in Kosovo. So that was a means for Kosovo Serb integration. And we see where we got with this, how the dialogue entirely failed. We need a reset of the Western policy in the whole of the region to span all these presentations today, and the values-based one. And this is the tragedy of post-February 24 era since last year. The June last year, extraordinary granting of the EU, including a shift on German policy and many other member states in the EU, granting extraordinarily outside the conditionality candidate status to Ukraine, based on them defending our values, bloodily defending them, was a potential revival of the stability-focused, non-strategic enlargement policy of the EU in the Western Balkans, and it did not come true. Instead, we saw a doubling down on this kind of values-free, bureaucratic autopilot policy we see on both ends of the Atlantic. So that's behind the Montenegro mess we've co-created. I completely agree with Milka. That's behind what we've seen in Bosnia, which is a kind of, I call this land swap 2, with the election law negotiations for 2 years. And that's behind the entire mess we see in the north of Kosovo, which is a mess at the core of which is our Serbia policy and not changing strategically our Serbia policy. And let's kick out. We had been successful on a few lessons learned. And one was not to look at the region through the biggest troublemakers as the ones that we need to solve the issue. That includes Serbia, that includes Kosovo. And I hear that Mr. Rama, Prime Minister, just held a lecture to Kosovars today. Let's also not include Albania into solving the Kosovo Serb issue. The West needs to get serious, and they need to steal.
Bodo, I need to move to Dan.
Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Thank you very much, Dan.
I can't see the dialogue restarting without some fundamental changes. One would, of course, be the withdrawal of the so-called consequences, the sanctions on Kosovo. I don't see how anybody in Pristina can go back to the dialogue until the EU consequences are withdrawn. I also think we need new mediators, but I wouldn't insist on that before talking with Serbia if I were to suggest what Pristina should do. I think it should make it very clear that it's willing to go back to the dialogue, with the condition being the lifting of the consequences, and that the first item on the agenda must be the insurrectionist plot of September 24th, with Serbia given an opportunity to explain precisely what the origins of this event were, what their plans were, and who was involved. It's time for Serbia to make a clean breast of it. There's no substitute for that.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Ralph.
So I would agree with Dan. I think the first order of business has to be the simple realization that sanctions against Kosovo are just completely wrong. So I think as long as sanctions are in place, the dialogue will go nowhere, because it shows that there's a bias here. Second of all, I think I don't agree with Dan's second point. I think the new EU team is absolutely essential, because Lajčák comes from Slovakia. You have Borrell, who is Spanish, and those two diplomats are in charge. And all of us here know that Spain and Slovakia do not recognize Kosovo. So I'd say that lifting of sanctions and change of staff is an absolute, it's a way to restart this process, in my view. In terms of making it regional, Rama's proposal is, I think, self-serving. He wants it regional because he thinks that this is something that's going to help him get more influence in the region. I think it's a non-starter in my view. And I would add that the most important, I think the EU here is not the main problem at the moment. I'm sure Bodo is incredibly surprised to hear me say that. But I think the EU is not the problem right now. I think Washington is the problem. So unless there's a change of a breath of fresh air needs to be felt in Washington before the region can move on, in my view. And I'll stop there.
Okay, Ivana, I want to give you the last few minutes. You have written for the Telegram that Putin was opening a new front in the Balkans, and I want to give you the opportunity because Maria highlighted how much Russian media has grown exponentially in Serbia, and I think actually the West in general dismisses the influence of all these outside media. Now even Orban is buying media in Macedonia and other and also in Serbia. So but the fact is probably the biggest, one of the major threats to the region is Putin, is Moscow. And of course, he doesn't need to put anybody in the air or roll tanks obviously from Moscow. It's not a likely thing to do because he has surrogates and proxies in Serbia and Bosnia. And so I would just like to hear your thoughts very quickly about why it's clear to you that this is what Putin has done, and is the West completely asleep at the switch on this?
So first of all, after the full invasion last year, a lot of people started paying attention to actually what's happening in the Balkans in relations to Russia. But I've been tracking Russia's efforts since 2016 in the region. RT and Sputnik, specifically RT started last year, but Sputnik has been there for many, many years. And it's not the only media how Russia operates. Russia operates, unlike the West, in a very sophisticated matters. Like, for example, they use bloggers, they use social media influencers. It's not about RT and Sputnik only. They use Putin understands perfectly how culture, how, for example, history matters to the Serbs. And Russia has been investing tremendous resources in information operations in the Balkans. As I mentioned just earlier, when you think about a hybrid war, it's really not only about the use of kinetic use of force, but the kinetic use of force that comes after setting informational conditions to start a war. And let's call a spade a spade. Both Belgrade and Moscow have been preparing the Serbs for conflict in Kosovo, whether through graffiti, whether through songs. What I just, for example, mentioned, they've been investing tremendous resources in the youth movements, printing books, organizing panels. So it's a real thing. And let's also not forget that the role of the Serbian Orthodox Church also plays a very important role to appeal to the far-right movements, that basically thinking that both in Republika Srpska, but also in Kosovo, the Serbs will stay without their important land, especially in Kosovo, where a lot of monasteries are. And that vulnerability, Russia has been exploiting for many years. Certainly, Russia indeed sent Serbia actually was buying, weapons from Russia, but I'm not so, worried about those particular weapons, because that's not really the whole point. The whole point really is that Putin indeed he has proxies that he can always use as a little green man to conduct similar operation to the one that we saw in Ukraine in 2014. As a matter of fact, it's exactly something what we almost saw 2 weeks ago with the help of Serbia. One other thing, that I want to emphasize, in addition to media, Russian soft power, whether in culture, whether in religion, really play a very important role. And also, you really just need to open the Telegram channels that are Russian networks that peddle very coordinated messages. As a matter of fact, last year, there is a famous Russian channel called Cyberfront Z that is linked to Wagner Group. They organize numerous panels on Kosovo and on Republika Srpska, and those are information operations channels that Russia has been using. So this thing is real. The problem with the West, there are two things. Vučić, let's not forget, he was a minister of information. He understands so well that whoever holds and whoever has access to information is the one who will win the battlefield. And the West did not want to rattle Vučic's cage and did not want to interfere by investing in free media and investing in the same manner that, for example, Russia is investing in the media space. I'm not saying, that the West should ever peddle disinformation, but for example, I do not see a lot of young bloggers in Serbia, and I'm confident to say there are still, certain pro-Western young Serbs who have platforms to spread the truth. And in part, it is because what we've been discussing over the past 2 hours, that the West has been appeasing Vučić out of fear that he will go with Russia. But guess what? He is already with Russia. He needs Russia for his political survival. And this is precisely why I still, do believe that the West should invest in media, and NATO should send hybrid warfare teams to respond to Russian influence operations.
Thank you very much, Ivana. I want to say one last thing before we go. I think Agon's essay that was published by New Lines Institute gives a really comprehensive overview on the history and leading it up to the current time. I think it's a really great piece, and actually most policymakers in Washington would really benefit by reading it, and that's one of the objectives of the New Lines Institute. And I want to thank all of our panelists and the journalists that joined us today. It was long, but it was really comprehensive, as much as you can do in a limited amount of time. And I want to thank everybody and hope to see all of you soon. And please stay safe out there. It's a crazy time in the world. Goodbye, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.